Hello everybody, welcome back to the table. What I wanted to do today was talk about rigging your ships and going from your basic assembled ship to something that's assembled, and I don't even know if you can see the thread on there, but rigged up, ready to go. But yeah, more of sharing some things I've run into trying to do this. So I've done now two ships, and each one was done slightly different. Not because I really wanted to do it differently, but mostly because I made some mistakes. Now, fortunately, on the table from a distance, I think they look pretty good, and they work. But this was the first one I did, so I wanted to share some of the oopsies I made, and then show you some of the corrections I made. Still not perfect. These are the only two ships I've ever done rigging for, and just between the two I learned some different things, so I just wanted to share that. Now, first of all, the first thing I learned is that the thread that you get in your Master and Commander starter set is actually quite a bit. Clearly, you could go to just about any store that sells thread and fabrics and whatnot, and get a huge spool of thread in case you run low. But what I decided is that the first one I tried to build, so like here's maybe a tip number one if you're going to list these, is don't be shy in using the thread that's included. What I tried to do at first was I wanted to use as little thread as possible and create as little waste as possible, because why throw away perfectly good thread? And I haven't found a use for my scrap thread. But what I did at first was I would leave the thread on the spool, and so I would, like if it said to, because the instructions will tell you kind of where to wrap some of your lines. So let me bring this in a little bit more here. So if the instructions said to put a line here on the top, I would very carefully, work myself a little loop, if I can get a little loop here. But I would put my loop, let's start with a big loop here so I can actually do this. And then I would try very hard to keep the loop near the end of the thread as possible. And then with my loop, which I don't know, I just realized this might be super hard to see on camera, but I would put my loop where it needed to go to start my threading, pull it tight, but I would try to hold this in such a way that you're pulling the long end through, so you have very little excess on the other side. So instead of having like a lot of thread over here and pulling, I'd keep very little and then try to hold that in place and then pull the long end to try and shrink that loop down. And that works for some places on the ship. It doesn't work in every place. And so I found that if you were trying to kind of thread things in between masts and whatnot, that holding this big spool while you're trying to run thread through different areas, this doesn't fit very well. Right? This is too big to fit through. So my first thing that I just decided at some point was just go ahead and cut long pieces of thread. Maybe take and lay the thread into the paths that I thought the thread would take, and kind of guesstimate how much thread I would need and just cut it extra long. So that would be my first thing, is don't hesitate to just cut long pieces of thread and then work with that. I'm sure a lot of people probably have already figured that out, but that was something that I had to learn because I was really trying to conserve the thread. The other thing too is the instructions that they have you in the book, they actually also have the instructions online, and I still haven't printed them out for myself yet, but I'm going to print them out because having to flip back and forth in the book, it's kind of difficult because without having to lay the book flat and ruin the spine and binding, I have to constantly keep setting my model down, opening the book, and looking. And because of that, I made some mistakes in how they wanted things threaded. So, for instance, the threading should actually, from here, there's one that should go from here up and then from here down. So I should have like a little triangle. And then also I have thread that goes here all the way down here. But actually I should have one from like this middle section. So you almost got 3 pieces of thread coming down. It looks, less of a sharp triangle. Again, fortunately, it still looks okay, and it helps give a little bit of difference between the different ships, just having a little bit of difference in the rigging. But someone who clearly knows what they're doing probably would look at that and go, yeah, you really messed that up. Well, as I look at it, I see how it doesn't follow the book exactly. Also here, there's some rigging that goes on the sides of the masts that attach to the sides of the ship. And it actually is supposed to start at the top of the mast. It comes down, feeds through a hole that they have here in the hull, and then attaches up to this secondary spot. What I did with this one is it all goes to this middle part, so I don't have any of the threading that goes to the top. I do here on the front, where I start at the top, come down to the hole, and it whips around and comes back to this midsection. But that means I don't have consistency with the rigging. Alright, see, like this one here, I started at the top. So this back one and the very front one I did the way you're supposed to, but I messed up the middle one. But again, it just shows, a little bit of difference between ships. So it wasn't on purpose. It was by mistake. But again, it was a learning thing. Afterwards, I see it. Even here in the front, you have these front rigging lines. This most front one that attaches at the very front is actually supposed to be at the top of this mast. And what that does is it creates a little bit of separation between these 2 lines. So these are really close together because I should have had it up here. And just moving it up this, maybe not even a 1/4 of an inch makes a great deal of a difference in the separation between these 2 lines. So this first ship, even though it seems okay, there are some mistakes that I made that I tried to correct on the second one. And this one turned out a little bit better. I already see one thing that I forgot to do. There is a piece of thread a rigging that goes to the front here and then ties down to this bottom part, and I completely forgot to do that. So I might just take a small piece of my trash thread and go ahead and run a little piece of thread from here to here. And that leads me to the next tip for when you make mistakes. What I did when doing this ship is there was a couple spots that I think I really messed up on, and so I just cut all the thread off in that one spot and then just ran a repair job to the one spot I messed up on. So that's another thing I would say is don't be afraid. If you think you really messed something up, cut it out and rerun it. And it is tough though. I don't have my little friend with me. I tried to bring over some of my supplies, but tweezers, that's another thing I got. I got some tweezers that I use to help reach in to grab things because my fingers are just too big to get in here completely. So that would be tip number 2, is get some tweezers. Now, here's an example of the front rigging there that I ran, the difference between putting all the threading here, but I moved this one to the top, and see how it's given some nice separation here between these 2 lines. And that just makes these front sails hang a little bit better. I think it looks better. And another thing too that I did was I don't wrap the thread as much. What I did on the first ship is in some of these spots I'd have the thread wrapped around a few times to try and hold it in place while I ran it to other parts of the ship. Well, what that ended up doing was creating these huge blocks of thread that, again, they don't look too out of place, but to someone who's an experienced rigger on ships, it probably looks terrible. So I've started, in order to help hold things in place, just use glue. I actually saw this on somebody else's channel where they would maybe wrap the thread one time, kind of pull it tight, and then drop a dab of glue. And then when that dries, that holds the thread in place for you. Works out great. And then you can run it to the rest of the ship. So when trying to do like the ends here of this little I don't want to call that I don't know what the official name of that is, but it's on the front of the ship here. It's got some sail on it, but there's just a little spot where you're supposed to wrap the thread here and then run it to some other places. And again, that's hard to do, you know, if you just take it, wrap it once. So I just drop a little bit of glue, run it, wrap it once, and then run it down to different parts of the ship. And again, I use the glue to help hold the thread in place. And what that does is that helps cut down on how many times I have to wrap the thread or how many knots I have to make. I just let the glue do the work. So I still wrap it like once. That way it kind of has the illusion that you've wrapped your rope and your rigging, but the glue does a lot of the work. So those are probably the biggest things. Now another tip that I learned, and I haven't used it too much, but I have used it and it's not too terrible. But sometimes as you are running your rigging, you'll notice that as you pull things tight, what's interesting is that it might create slack in different parts of the ship's rigging, just the way science and physics work. And so what a suggestion was is you take a dab of glue and you'll glue down part of the thread, and what you can do is take like tweezers or your X-Acto blade or something, and you'll pull the thread tight. So like this one here kind of was a little loose after pulling in some other rigging here. So I put in a dab of glue up on top of this mast, and then what I did was I pushed the thread forward and put the slack of the thread up into the glue. And again, when you're back, you know, a couple feet from the table, you don't really see that you've pulled that tight up against the mast, but it does help pull some of the slack. So again, a little bit of glue and a little bit of just kind of shifting around how some of your rigging is can pull slack out. So that was something else that helped. Also on this ship, I corrected the problem with the middle mast of running some rigging from this top mast down to this middle hole and then back up to this area here. So the second one, I follow the instructions better. So I guess that was a tip in there somewhere too, is print off the rigging instructions from the Warlord Games website that shows the rigging, how it's done. Alright, so that's a couple ideas. The other problem that I'm having, and I haven't quite figured out what to do exactly, but I haven't seen any real instructions on putting, and I think these are called rat lines. They're the rigging on the side of the ship that would, you know, take a lot of time if you were to thread this out yourself. So what they've done is they've included these little acetate, little thin pieces of plastic with the rigging printed on it. But the problem is there's no instructions really on how to apply them to the ship. So again, this is trial and error, and I don't think, you know, they're really meeting my expectations. So the first ones I did on my first practice ship is I tried to glue them. I'm gluing them here to the hull of the ship and leaning them in up against the mast as much as possible. But the problem is what they've included is taller than some of these parts of the mast. So if you can see here, the rat lines in the rigging goes up past, you know, these couplers that hold the different lengths of mast together on the ship. And so what I did was with some really small scissors, I came in and clipped them down. So now they go from like the whole of the ship up to kind of this section here, like where there's some kind of, you know, I'm not sure the official name of that, but the rigging looked like it fit better. But I was like, I don't know, I don't see any instructions on cutting that. And the problem is when I was cutting one of these, I ended up cutting rigging. So I had to glue the thing in place and then re-rig the ship. So I was like, well, the second attempt I just didn't cut them. But here's the problem. Where these are going based on pictures I've seen, is some of the actual rigging of the ship blocks the placement of these rat lines. So this one here specifically, because it actually kind of loops from the ship, right? Because it's supposed to go from the top of the mast through this hole, and then the thread comes up to this part of the mast. So that kind of creates a loop here on the side of the ship. But this rat line, in order for me to really place this, I have to put it between the two pieces of thread of rigging. But then the acetate has a hard time fitting up on the mast because there's rigging in the way on the other side because there's a loop of thread. So what I did on the second one was I glued the acetate on the inside of the rigging. So now I still have both lines of rigging here on the outside of the rat line, but it is a little harder to fit. But a lot of the pictures I looked, this rat lines actually go on the outside of the ship, and in some cases they come down, you know, pretty far. It wouldn't work quite the same on this ship because there's cannons right here. So I had to admit, I haven't quite figured out what I'm supposed to do with the rat lining here. And part of me is almost wanting to just leave it off of future ships, but it almost seems like such an iconic thing that you don't want to leave it off. But I don't have any good tips for that yet. That's still kind of an experiment. So if any of you have tips on how those should work, or maybe some good picture resources I could look at for assembling that, that'd be very welcome. So another problem that I have is the glue I'm using. Now this glue works really good for the thread and securing the rigging, but it does horrible on this plastic acetate because it frosts. And I don't know if you can see that. Again, from a distance, when you're playing the game, you're looking down on the ships, you don't really notice it. But when you pick up the model to kind of play with it, you're going to notice that it frosts. And I know that's kind of a problem with super glues. So the glue that I have here, this is something from the dollar store, and that's probably maybe not the best, but it's the original super glue gel. So if somebody has a glue that they like to use, maybe you could leave that in the comments and say, well, here's what I use. You know, maybe there's a good super glue out there that doesn't frost on this clear plastic that you could recommend. The other problem that I'm having, and again, it's just trying to learn, is putting the sails on. So I've done them differently on each ship, and I'm not sure. I think this ship, it turned out better. So the problem is the sails they give you, I think, are kind of nice. They're a nice kind of cardstock, and you kind of curl them up, but you got to figure out how to stick them on the masts and on the little arms that come off. The thing is that I ran into is some of the instructions on how to tie your rigging, you tie underneath this arm, but the problem is you got to fit sails up in there somehow to make it look like they're attached to these arms. So what I'm going to do now is, when the instructions look like you tie under the arm of a mast, I'm actually just going to tie everything on top. That way, when I'm trying to attach things to the top arms, I don't have thread in the way. And the other thing too is, on this one, I think it's a mistake that I made, because again, there's no pictures that show how to put the sails on. I know they leave a lot of that to people to figure out for themselves. I'm just not that clever yet. But I was putting them, I've rolled these sails so that they were sitting on top of, again, kind of this platform on the masts, and that shouldn't be. So on my second ships, I glued them under those platforms, and then I was able to attach the bottom sails here to the arms, and that looked more appropriate. So again, it's just a matter of trying to plan out a little bit how you do the sail. So I think the second ship turned out a little bit better as far as sails go. But again, fortunately, when you look at them from a distance, if you look at these ships from a distance on the table, they don't look too bad. It's only after I start to point out my own mistakes that I look and go, oh man, I wish I could have done that better. But those are some things that I've discovered putting this together. So one day, what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint this up, because I guess maybe that's another tip I have, is just some ideas on painting. So in the main book, it does have some sample color schemes that you can go with. So the first color scheme I did here is I just went with, I don't have my spray, but I actually have a base, kind of a desert coat. It's like I think it's Crusader sand. It's Flames of War. It was for painting British tanks, desert. And what I do is that's what I use for the whole base coat for the ship. I do that because any part that I don't paint, once I put some wash on there, it ends up looking kind of like wood. It's not too dark, but it looks pretty good once you put some wash in there. And the wash that I use is an Argax Earth shade, and it's from Games Workshop. And once you put that in there, it fills in the panel lines of the wood planking really good, and it darkens it enough that it does kind of look like wood. And then it's a good base coat, so whatever colors you add to paint the ship I think turns out pretty good. So this was a sampling of like a British coloring they had. And then the sample US coloring they had was like a black with some white stripes, and then various colors to use on the masts. So what I do appreciate is the fact that they're pretty generous with the color schemes of the ships. And I actually found that fascinating because I've never dealt with Age of Sail before. I never really considered that these folks actually took times to paint their homes, because in a way this was a sailor's home. So I found that you could probably paint these just about anything you want and it would turn out okay, because the crews probably had some say in how they painted their ships. So I was kind of a little worried about painting and accuracy, but just following the basic guides I got some kind of close, you know, like, I guess you could say that's a US color scheme or not. But yeah, so what I'm going to do, back to my original thought, is I will do, after I paint this one up, before I rig it, now that I've done it a couple times, I'll actually do, maybe show you how I run some of the thread and the rigging. So, you know, it's one thing for people to show you the finished product, but for those interested, if you are interested, let me know, and I will definitely do a video where I will film some of the rigging and how it goes and how you can do it for yourself. But those are some tips that I wanted to share, some ideas and thoughts on putting together your Black Seas ships here. And if you've done anything, you know, like this, maybe for other games or other ships, and you have tips that you want to share, please do. Because again, I'm just learning. So clearly I don't have a lot of skill in this, but it is actually a lot funner than I thought it would be, and it is a lot more frustrating than I thought it would be. But a friend of mine, a tip that he had was you could just get a broom, cut off the, you know, the plastic whisker part of the broom, and just kind of glue those pieces on. And I think it looks pretty good on, he has some ships that are a lot smaller, but I don't think they look quite as good as actually running thread and rigging. So if you've thought about it, I'd say just go for it, give it a shot, and if I can do it, anybody can do it. So anyway, we'll leave those thoughts with you. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you later.